Snow swirled like ash when Clara Ames stepped into the town square, clutching 3 wrinkled dollars and the worn boots her late husband left behind. Men had gathered around the merchant's wagon, shouting prices for winter hands. Strong backs to cut wood, haul water, and fight off wolves if the herds ran thin. The merchant's voice rang sharp. "Last man left, mountain drifter, no kin, no debts, but no manners either." Laughter rolled through the crowd. The man on the block stood taller than most, wrapped in a wolf-hide coat, hat low, a scar tracing his jaw like a line of old frostbite. Clara felt the cold crawl through her gloves, but she raised her hand anyway. $3, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The laughter hit harder now. "A widow buying herself a man," someone yelled. Her boy, Noah, clung to her skirt, staring at the stranger with wide, frightened eyes. The merchant smirked. "Lady, this ain't a pet auction." She met his grin with quiet fire. $3, she repeated, "and boots that still walk straight." The mountain man's gaze lifted, gray, calm, unreadable, and in that single glance, the noise around them fell away. He stepped down, picked up the boots, and nodded once as if her courage meant more than her coin. No swagger, no smile, just a man accepting his duty. The crowd parted while they passed, some shaking their heads, others whispering about sin and desperation. Clara didn't answer any of it. She walked toward the edge of town, leading the mule that carried all she had left, the stranger following with his axe across his shoulder, boots slung in one hand. Snow crept deeper, coating the ground like ash over memory. Behind her, voices faded. Ahead lay miles of silence and one small cabin at the foot of the ridge. She didn't know his name, didn't ask, but something about the way he matched her steps felt old, familiar, like a kindness remembered from a lifetime ago. The wind cut harder as the sky dimmed, and for the first time in months, Clara whispered a prayer not for mercy, but for endurance. Winter had come early, and she had just bought her only chance to survive it. By the time they reached the ridge, the sun had sunk behind the pines, and the path turned to ice beneath the mule's hooves. Elias Ward, that was the name she learned only when the sheriff's clerk handed her the work contract, though he hadn't spoken a single word since they'd left town. The cabin waited at the valley's edge, its roof bowed under snow, smoke from the last fire long gone. Clara pushed the door open, and cold air spilled out like a ghost. Inside were rough logs, 2 chairs, and the cracked photograph of her husband nailed above the hearth. Elias set down his axe without a sound, his boots still slung over one shoulder, and began stacking wood in the corner as if he'd lived there all his life. Noah hovered near the stove, watching the stranger's every move, his small fingers gripping a wooden horse. "He ain't gonna stay forever, Mama?" the boy whispered. Clara didn't answer. Outside, the storm began to howl, and she saw Elias move toward the window, eyes scanning the tree line the way men do when they've seen danger before. His silence wasn't cold. It was heavy, like he carried something that couldn't fit into words. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, coarse with frost. "I'll keep the fire fed," he said, "and the roof dry." That was all. She nodded, pretending she wasn't trembling from more than the chill. As night deepened, he lit the hearth and stepped out to check the traps, disappearing into the white wind with a lantern that flickered like a lone star. Clara watched him go, feeling a pull she couldn't name, part fear, part memory, part trust she hadn't wanted to give again. Somewhere in that storm, the world felt smaller. Like every sound had vanished except her own breath and the faint echo of boots breaking snow. When he returned, carrying a frozen rabbit and a coat of frost across his shoulders, She saw his eyes clearly for the first time in the firelight, gray as the night she had once escaped. And suddenly, though she couldn't place why, her heart began to pound as if it recognized him long before her mind ever would. Morning came wrapped in white silence. The valley below their cabin looked buried, every fence post swallowed under snow, every sound softened like the world itself had stopped breathing. Clara Ames woke before dawn to the sound of chopping, steady, rhythmic, certain. Through the small frost-ringed window she saw Elias Ward at work, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, breath clouding in the bitter air. He didn't pause, didn't glance back, just split log after log until his arms and the axe seemed to move as one. It wasn't strength that struck her. It was precision, a kind of calm earned by someone who had lived through storms much worse than winter. She poured weak coffee, hands shaking from the cold, and thought of that winter years ago when she had fled the debt wagons. Men chained, women crying, the sheriff shouting orders. She'd stumbled into the trees that night, barefoot and bleeding, when a voice from the dark had said, "Keep running." She'd never seen his face, only the flash of a pistol shot and a man's hand cutting her bonds. For years, she'd believed that stranger dead. Now, every time Elias turned his face toward the light, the memory stirred like smoke under her ribs. By midday, the boy Noah had begun to trust him, trailing behind as Elias built a new pen from fallen limbs. "You got a horse, mister?" the child asked. "Had one," Elias murmured, setting a post. "Mountains took him." Clara listened from the porch, heart tightening at the quiet sorrow in those few words. There was something careful about the way he spoke, like each word had to pass a gate before leaving his mouth. She noticed his scar again, thin and pale near his wrist. The same shape she remembered on the man who'd freed her. But she pushed the thought aside. Hope, she'd learned, was a dangerous thing when winter still held your roof hostage. That night, when the storm came back hard, Elias sat by the hearth, sharpening his blade. The fire threw shadows up the wall, and Noah fell asleep with his head on his mother's lap. For a while, the silence between them stretched thin, filled only by the whetstone's scrape. Then Clara asked softly, "Why'd you come down from the mountains?" His hands paused, the knife glinting in firelight. "Wasn't meant to be alone forever," he said, and looked into the flame as though it might tell him what came next. Something in his tone made her chest ache, a kind of tired honesty that came from loss, not pride. When she blew out the lamp and the cabin went dark except for the glow of the coals, she lay awake listening to the storm rage outside and thought of that old night again. The pistol flash, the man who told her to run, and wondered if fate had brought him back, or if she'd simply hired her own ghost to keep her alive through one more winter. By the fourth day, the sky cleared, leaving the snow hard and glittering like crushed glass across the valley. Clara hitched her mule and rode into town with a small sack of eggs, hoping to trade for flour before the road froze again. The mountain man followed on foot, quiet as always, his coat stiff with frost, his axe strapped to his back. Folks stopped talking when they saw them, her riding, him walking behind like a hired ghost. Near the store porch, Harlan Crick leaned on a post, fat and smug in his wool coat. "Well now," he drawled, "the widow brought her mountain pet to town. Tell me, mister, does she pay by the hour or by the cord?" The laughter that followed made Clara's face burn, but Elias didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stepped forward, took her sack, and placed it on the scale inside as though none of them existed. "I'll take flour," he said flatly, voice like dry gravel, "and salt enough to last the storm." When Harlan reached for the measure, Elias slid 3 silver coins across the counter. Clean, bright, untouched by dirt. The store fell quiet. Everyone knew men like him didn't carry coin unless they'd earned it hard. Harlan's eyes narrowed. "Didn't know mountain drifters made that kind of money," he said, pretending a smile. Elias met his gaze, unflinching. "Didn't know merchants made theirs off widows' debts?" A flicker of shame, or fear, crossed the merchant's face. Clara caught her breath, not sure if she should thank him or worry for him. They left the store without another word, the bag slung across his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. Snow squeaked under their boots, the wind low and mean between buildings. "You shouldn't have spoken to him like that," she said finally. "He'll find a way to make you pay." Elias kept walking, his stride slow and steady. "He already has," he murmured. She didn't ask what he meant. When they reached the edge of town, the bell at the church tower tolled noon, echoing through the frozen air. Clara glanced back once and saw Harlan watching from the porch, his jaw tight, his hand tapping the ledger he always carried. She knew then this winter wouldn't end quietly. Behind her, Elias said nothing, but his shadow stretched long beside hers on the snow, steady and sure, as though he'd already chosen which side of the coming fight he was on. That night, the wind rose again, rattling the shutters like bones. Clara mended Noah's coat by the hearth, while Elias worked outside, his lantern swaying against the black snow. Every few minutes she caught herself listening for his boots, comforted by the rhythm of them, even when she didn't want to be. When he finally came in, his hair dusted white, he placed 2 rabbits on the table without a word and sat to unlace his gloves. The firelight caught the inside of his wrist, and there it was again. The thin white scar curved like the edge of a moon. Her needle froze mid-stitch. She had seen that mark once, long ago, the night she'd broken free from the chain gang, when a man had cut her bonds with a hunting knife and whispered, "Run until you see the ridge." He'd been bleeding from the same wrist when he pushed her into the trees. Back then, she thought he'd died for helping her. Now that same scar burned in front of her eyes. Alive. She looked away before he noticed, heart thundering so hard it made the thread tremble in her hands. Noah, half asleep near the stove, whispered, "Mama, is he gonna stay?" And she answered too quickly, "Only till the thaw." Elias looked up then, gray eyes soft in the firelight. "Storm will break by spring," he said quietly, "if the walls hold." His voice was low, but something in it cracked the silence like truth breaking through ice. He reached for his knife to clean it, and when the blade caught the light again, she saw the faint initials carved on the handle. C.A., her name, burned there years ago when her husband had traded that same knife to a passing cowboy for help on the trail. For a moment, time folded on itself. Every sound faded, the storm, the crackle, the boys breathing, and only that scar, that knife, and that voice remained. She forced herself to speak steady, pretending not to shake. "You been to these parts before?" she asked. He studied the blade, then answered, "A long time ago. Some debts take years to settle." She didn't press, didn't dare. When he stepped outside again to stack the wood, she pressed a hand to her chest, whispering to the quiet cabin. It can't be him. But deep down, she already knew. The next morning broke brittle and blue, sunlight bouncing off the snow until it hurt to look. Clara rode into town alone, saying she needed yeast, though the truth was she needed to clear her head. She'd barely slept, the memory of that scar turning in her thoughts like a restless bird. At the post office window, a gust caught the stack of papers pinned to the board, and one old sheet fluttered free, yellowed and half torn. She caught it before it hit the ground, meaning only to tack it back. But then she saw the name, Elias Ward. Her breath caught. The drawing beneath was rough, but the eyes were unmistakable. Gray, watchful, weary, the charge read aiding prisoners in flight. Assault on a foreman. She felt the floor tilt. Her hands trembled as she folded the paper and slipped it into her pocket. When she turned, Harlan Crick was standing in the doorway, eyes sharp as pins. "You found yourself some reading, Mrs. Ames?" he asked with a grin that never reached his eyes. She forced a smile. "Just old paper, nothing more." But Harlan stepped closer, plucked the edge of her glove, and said softly, "You're keeping company with a man wanted in 3 counties. Sheriff will want to know that." Her pulse thudded. "If the sheriff wanted him, he'd have come himself," she replied, but her voice trembled just enough to make Harlan's smirk wider. "Maybe he will," he said. "Maybe I'll help him along." She rode home fast, the wind sharp against her face, mind racing between fear and disbelief. The cabin came into view just as smoke rose from the chimney. Inside, Elias knelt near the hearth, teaching Noah how to whittle a toy horse from a block of pine. The sight almost undid her. This quiet man, patient and gentle, could not be the criminal that poster claimed. Yet the proof burned in her pocket like a coal. He looked up as she entered, eyes calm as ever, though a hint of knowing flickered there. "You went to town," he said simply. She nodded, hanging her shawl, careful not to meet his gaze. "I did." He studied her a moment, then returned to the carving. "Then you already know," he said, voice steady but low. "What they called me for doing right." The words froze her. He didn't explain, didn't defend himself, just kept carving until the wood shaped smooth under his blade. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of snow again. Inside, Clara stood still, the poster heavy in her hand, realizing she had hired not a stranger, but the man whose mercy had once cost him everything. The storm came sudden, roaring down from the ridge before noon. The sky turned the color of slate, and snow began to fall in thick, slanting sheets that buried the path. Within minutes, Clara and Noah worked fast to shutter the windows, while Elias fought the wind outside, driving stakes into the roofline to keep it from lifting. When he stumbled back through the door, his coat white and his breath a cloud, he dropped the latch beam in place and said, "We're locked in till it breaks." The wind screamed against the walls, shaking the cabin like a beast. Clara lit the lantern, but the flame flickered, throwing shadows that danced across his face. Those gray eyes watching the storm like it was an old enemy returned. Hours passed in silence except for the howl outside and the crack of wood splitting in the hearth. Noah huddled under a quilt, eyes wide. "Is it gonna take the house?" he whispered. "Not if I can help it," Elias said, rising to brace the door with his shoulder as the hinges groaned. Clara moved beside him, pressing her weight against the beam. Their hands met on the wood, rough skin to skin, and for a moment she felt the warmth of his palm through the cold. Real, steady, human. When the wind eased, Elias stepped away, chest heaving. "You shouldn't have to fight this alone," he said. "No woman should." His voice cracked on the last word. Clara looked at him in the trembling light and finally asked what had haunted her since the day she saw his scar. "Why did you free us?" He froze, then sank onto the bench, staring at the fire as though seeing another time. "Because I couldn't stand to see good folks sold like cattle," he said. "I thought I'd done right. Sheriff called it treason." He flexed his hand, the scar catching the glow. "Some didn't make it out. Others ran. You ran." Her breath caught. He already knew. "You remember," she whispered. He nodded once. "Didn't think I'd find you alive." The storm pounded harder, but inside the cabin a different stillness grew. Noah slept. The wind softened, and Clara sat across from Elias, the poster still hidden in her pocket. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't need to. "You saved my life once," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time I save yours." He looked at her then, and for the first time since he'd come down from the mountains, something unguarded crossed his face. Gratitude mixed with disbelief. The look of a man who'd stopped expecting mercy and just found it again. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the world buried under white silence, the kind that makes every step sound like a secret. Smoke curled from the chimney as Clara poured coffee into a tin cup, trying to ignore the unease that had taken root in her chest. Elias had gone out to check the traps, his coat pulled tight, his figure vanishing between the pines. She wanted to call after him, to warn him about Harlan's threat, but the words stuck in her throat. By the time she saw the riders cresting the hill, 2 deputies and Harlan in his fur collar, it was already too late. They dismounted at the fence, breath steaming, the sheriff's badge glinting dull silver. "Morning, Mrs. Ames," the taller deputy called. "We're here for Elias Ward." Her hand trembled so hard she nearly dropped the cup. "He's not here," she said quickly, though the sound of his axe echoed faintly through the trees behind her. Harlan smiled. "Then you won't mind if we take a look." He pushed past her before she could answer, boots grinding snow into the floorboards. Noah clung to her skirt, wide-eyed as the sheriff followed, brushing frost from his mustache. "He's wanted in 3 counties, he said, voice almost gentle. "Harboring him could cost you your land." Clara felt the blood drain from her face, but before she could speak, the door burst open and Elias stepped inside, the axe still in his grip. He froze at the sight of the guns. For a long moment, no one moved. "Easy, son," the sheriff said. "Ain't no need for foolishness." Elias lowered the axe slowly, eyes never leaving Harlan. "You told them," he said. The merchant smirked. "Should have kept to your mountains." When they bound Elias's wrists, Clara felt something break inside her. "He didn't hurt anyone," she cried, stepping forward, but the sheriff shook his head. "Law says different." The rope bit into Elias's wrists, reopening the old scar until blood ran down his hand. Clara saw it and stepped in front of him. "If you take him," she said, voice shaking but loud enough to carry through the cold air, "then you take me too. I owe him my life." The sheriff hesitated, guilt flickering behind his eyes. Harlan scoffed. "You'll regret that." Elias shook his head, whispering to her, "Don't. Let it be." She met his gaze, tears burning. "I won't lose another good man to a lie." But they dragged him away, leaving tracks deep in the snow, the rope trailing behind like a scar across the earth. As the riders disappeared into the trees, Clara stood in the doorway, hands clenched, heart hammering, and whispered to the wind, "Not again." This time she swore she would not let silence bury the truth. By noon the town square was alive again, though the air felt colder than the storm ever had. Clara rode in on her mule, coat torn, eyes burning with the kind of fire that comes when fear dies and purpose takes its place. The crowd gathered near the jail steps, whispering as Elias Ward stood chained before the sheriff, snow melting on his shoulders. Harlan Crick paced proudly beside the post, ledger in hand like a crown of proof. "This man broke the law," he said to anyone who'd listen, "and the woman who hired him owes for his crimes." The sheriff shifted uneasily, but the merchant's influence ran deep. He could make ruin sound like righteousness. Clara stepped through the crowd without slowing. "That ledger in your hand," she called, "ain't full of law, it's full of lies." Harlan turned, sneering. "Careful, Widow Ames. You're already in debt enough to choke on." She climbed the steps and held out an old, folded page, Elias's name written in the same ink as her own years ago. "You remember this?" she said. "You sold me once, too, for $12 interest. This man broke your chain, not your law." Murmurs rippled through the square. The sheriff took the page, frowning. "She's right," he said after a moment. "This mark here, your ledger, Harlan, matches the warrant you wrote, not the court's seal." The merchant's face drained of color. "You'd take her word over mine?" he sputtered. Clara turned to the crowd, her voice steady but trembling with emotion. "This man saved families you left to freeze. He did what you all were too afraid to do." The wind carried her words like bells. The sheriff stepped forward, pulling the chain from Elias's wrists. "No law holds where truth's been twisted," he said quietly. The iron hit the ground with a dull ring, and for a heartbeat, the whole square went silent. Elias flexed his hand, blood seeping through the scar, and met Clara's eyes. Harlan tried to speak, but the crowd was already turning away, their silence louder than any verdict. Clara bent, picked up the chain, and dropped it in the snow between them. "Debt's paid," she said softly. The merchant's lips moved, but no sound came. The sheriff nodded once toward Elias. "You're free to go, son. Sorry it took this long." Elias looked at the faces around him, people who had once called him outlaw, and then at Clara, standing with her chin high, tears cutting lines through the dust on her cheeks. "You shouldn't have come," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "I couldn't let them hang the only man who ever set me free." The crowd began to drift, whispers fading into the wind, leaving only the two of them on the steps as the church bell rang slow and hollow through the cold. Spring crept in slow, soft as breath over the ridge, melting the snow that had buried everything they'd fought for. The river ran again, brown with thaw and memory, and the fields around the cabin showed the first green in months. Clara Ames stood by the porch rail, sunlight touching her face, watching Elias Ward split the last of the winter logs. His arm still carried the faint rope marks, but his eyes were calmer now. No longer the eyes of a hunted man, but of one finally allowed to stop running. Noah chased a stray chicken through the yard, laughing for the first time since the storm, and the sound made her heart ache in a good way. When Elias set the axe down, he looked at her, half smiling, the quiet kind of smile that says more than words ever could. "You kept the roof standing," he said. She nodded. "You kept the fire alive." They stood that way for a long while, the wind carrying the smell of pine and thawed earth. "Sheriff says they're burning Harlan's ledgers next week," Elias said, his tone even. "Town's starting fresh." Clara looked toward the horizon. "So should you." He glanced at the mountains, their peaks still white but softening under sun. "Maybe," he said, "but I reckon I'll stay till you don't need the wood split." She smiled, the smallest tear slipping down her cheek. "That might take a lifetime." He stepped closer, removing his hat as if the moment itself were sacred. "You saved me from more than a rope, Clara." She shook her head. "No. You just finally let someone stand beside you." For a moment, silence folded around them. Gentle, complete. Then Noah called out, holding up a sprig of green he'd found pushing through the mud. "Mama, look, it's growing." She took it, cradled it in her palm, and turned to Elias. "Maybe some things survive the winter after all." He smiled, his voice barely above a whisper. "If they're worth saving." The last of the snow slid from the roof, the sound like a sigh from the land itself. The world felt new, raw and forgiving. Clara placed the sprig in a small clay cup on the windowsill, and when she looked back, Elias had already gone to fetch another armful of wood. The day was bright, the air smelled of life, and for the first time since the night she'd bought him for $3, she didn't feel the weight of survival. Only the quiet peace of having chosen mercy and found home at last. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you'd seen her buy him in the square that day, would you have believed what mercy could build? Tell us in the comments.